So what did we learn from the Australian Grand Prix? Just how much advantage did Mercedes have, and are Ferrari or any other teams remotely within touching distance? We will, of course, also look at the pace of Verstappen's Red Bull and the McLaren of Norris, and we'll also see which cars look good and bad on tyre wear. So first of all then, let's begin with the average race pace across the whole race distance. So this chart from left to right shows fastest to slowest average race pace, and that's after laps like things under the safety car, so the virtual safety cars we had, or laps into the pits or out of the pits are removed, because those are generally outliers. They include pit stop time, for example, which is out of the driver and the car's control, so they're not really representative of pace. So this is the chart we get, the average lap times, and if we look on the left-hand side, we see this opening group. So the fastest guys, they are the top teams. It's exactly what we'd expect. And they're all within half a second per lap, which last season would have sounded big, but honestly, for the start of new regs, isn't ridiculous. But we will come back to this. So that's within half a second a lap. And then the second group we see is pretty much every other team except the Aston and the Cadillac. So all of these teams now lie between 1.5 seconds a lap and 2.5 seconds a lap slower on average than that Mercedes. So it is pretty big. There's a big jump. We go from the top four being within half a second to now 1.5 seconds is sort of Bortoletto here in the Audi, and that is impressive for the Audi to be heading up sort of the midfield now, although this midfield is much further adrift than last year, although that is to be expected. And then finally, pretty much as expected, we've got the Aston Martins here, and then the Cadillacs. Of course, Bottas didn't finish the race, so there's not much point looking at his times. And also with Aston, they were pretty much just running a test session. Look at how many tyres they used. Alonso 3 sets of soft. Stroll actually used 5 sets of tyres. So when you factor in that these guys were running nicer tyres, newer tyres, less laps also than Perez, you would have to say that, to be honest, the Aston was the slowest car on Sunday. So now let's head back to the top of the times to look at that, pretty much the podium battle, and that was between the two Ferraris and the two Mercedes cars. Now, one thing that might surprise you, Antonelli has the quickest race pace. Why is that? He finished behind Russell. Well, let's think about where he lost the time, and to be honest, a lot of it was at the start where he lost positions. So that's on the first lap. The opening lap is also an outlier. It's just all the cars are jostling. It's not a good measure of pace, so that's not included. And he also lost a little bit of time when Mercedes double stacked under that first VSC. And because of that, again, that's time that isn't due to his pace, it's due to the pit stop and it's due to the opening lap. So I guess a bit of a mistake on the opening lap perhaps, but still, overall, Antonelli was actually driving quicker than Russell. Of course, Russell was at the front, he could manage his pace a little bit more perhaps, but that is impressive from Antonelli. You will also notice that Hamilton sits ahead of Leclerc. Again, all of this is super tight within the gaps, but it did look like Hamilton was the more comfortable of the Ferrari drivers, which will be encouraging because with these new regs, they're a bit more like the older cars, away from ground effect, so perhaps they're starting to favour him a bit more. We did see him nearly get past Leclerc at the end of the race, although Leclerc did say he wasn't completely happy with his setup. The other thing I will say about these gaps being so close is that it's perhaps a bit misleading. Now, this group here, we see Leclerc only 0.135 per lap on average slower than Antonelli. I mean, it's literally a third of that to Russell. You know, these gaps are tiny, and that would suggest, especially given they all ran medium and then hard, that would suggest that it's insanely tight between these teams. And while they are clearly the top two at this moment, I wouldn't say it's that close. And why is that? Well, we have to go back and look at the strategy because, of course, Russell and Antonelli decided that they would pit at the VSC, and that was super early on. So to be honest, what they've done by that, of course, they've saved the pit stop time. They've saved about 10 seconds to pit under VSC. But in terms of strategy and in terms of overall pace, it does hurt them because they've thrown away that medium tyre when there was still life in it, and they've then had to do this super long stint on hard tyres. Look, that is a 46 lap stint for Antonelli, 46 laps again on the hards also for Russell. Meanwhile, Hamilton here, who extended his even more than Leclerc, only did 30 laps. And when you just look at these stints, the way that Hamilton and Leclerc did it, for raw pace, it's absolutely optimal. If there were no safety cars, no any disruption in the race, you would absolutely pit about half distance slightly earlier to switch to the hard tyre, and that's what Ferrari did. So although, yes, they lose a bit of time from that VSC and not using that VSC basically, what it does mean is that Ferrari basically ran on the better tyres for most of the race. Russell and Antonelli were dragging their hard tyres through to the end, and that hurt their pace. Hamilton and Leclerc did not have to do that. Of course, the price they paid, more pit stop time, but when you look at it just from overall pace, when pit stop time doesn't matter now, we're just trying to look at the car and the driver's pace, this basically inflates the pace of the Ferrari. So I would not say that Hamilton actually had better raw pace than Russell, and I would not say that either of them were within a tenth of the Mercedes. It's probably more like 2/10, although I would say most likely less than 3, which is still close, especially for the start of the regulations, but not quite this close. And before we move on, if you do like the look of the data you see in this video, it's actually all available on my own website, which I've recently just entirely reworked and rebuilt, so you can go and get access to that. It's pretty much my version of a channel membership. Rather than paywalling content, instead you get access to everything you see in these videos, so you can go and analyse the drivers and the sessions that you care about most. And of course, it supports the channel and me making the videos. And then what about the bigger picture with the Red Bull and the McLaren? Well, there was a bit of a gap. It now goes to 0.5 seconds that Verstappen was behind and 0.52 seconds on average per lap that Norris was behind. And they ran relatively similar strategies, both ran two-stop. So again, we have to factor in strategy for this as well. Verstappen, now of course, he had a bit more traffic, started further back, that would have hurt him. Norris, less so, although both of them have used an extra set of tyres compared to the top runners. And again, this doesn't look at pit stops, this looks at just raw pace. And your raw pace is going to be better if you've used an extra set of tyres. So I would say this is a little bit worrying at this stage for the Red Bull. For the McLaren, possibly more so, because Verstappen did start from the back of the grid, because they did have newer tyres, yet they're still half a second on average per lap slower than the top runners. Now, quite a bit of this gap back to Verstappen and Norris can actually be explained through tyre wear, so let's jump to that and have a look. So what are we seeing here? These are the laps throughout the stint. So the stints we're looking at here are all of the closing, or for Norris the middle stint, but it's the hard tyre stint. So these are towards the end of the race, pretty comparable for each driver. What are these? These are the lap times that they did. And what we do is we take away the fuel effect from these laps. So throughout the race, the fuel load gets burnt off, the cars get lighter. That naturally would have an impact of making them quicker. However, we can correct for this weight burning off, and therefore we just look at the evolution due to tyre wear. So when these laps are getting slower, and yes, sometimes it could be traffic or whatever, but over the course of the stint, these lap times are creeping up because of tyre wear. That's what we're trying to look at. Therefore, what we can see is the gradient, how steeply basically the lap times drop off. If they drop off more steeply, you've got worse tyre wear. Now, please ignore this one downtrending line for Verstappen. This was actually his opening stint, so completely different data set basically. It's this one here that was his closing hard tyre stint, so that's the one we can compare. And straight away, based off what I've said, hopefully you can see that is a horrendously steep line for Verstappen. We saw him complaining about it on the radio, we could see it on the tyre, his front left, I think, the graining just completely opened up that sort of upper surface of the tyre, and it caused him some horrific damage in terms of pace that initially was quick because we saw him catch up to Norris, and then, wow, it dropped off very significantly. What else can we see? Well, actually, Ferrari's line is the shallowest. Ferrari had the best tyre wear. We can see it summarised here. This is the Hamilton tyre wear, so on average, losing the least due to tyres, it looks like, compared to the rest. Relatively close to Russell. Norris, a little bit worse wear. Verstappen, absolutely horrendous wear on that stint. And what I can then also do for at least two of the teams is bring in the teammate comparison, and we see that Antonelli, slightly better wear than Russell. Hamilton managed slightly better wear-wise than Leclerc, who did actually have wear more comparable to Norris. So perhaps, again, this might be to do with him not being happy with that setup, if he was sliding around a bit more perhaps. And it was unfortunate not to get a Piastri or a Hajar comparison to go alongside Verstappen. Another thing we can look at is the consistency of each driver over the entire race distance. So this way of doing it is the standard deviation, which means lower is better and lower is more consistent. So at the top here, or I guess the bottom, you've got the most consistent drivers. And there is a bit of a trend. Firstly, you've got Bottas and Hajar in here who didn't complete all the laps. Same with Alonso. But also the slowest cars here, because they were so off the pace, they were never in any traffic, never having to lap anyone, and also never really racing anyone particularly. So you could argue those have to be compared amongst themselves, and the rest of the drivers should then be compared separately. And that leaves Hamilton, Lindblad and Verstappen as the standouts in the top three most consistent drivers. And I would say very impressive from Verstappen, given all the traffic, the overtaking, then sitting behind Norris for a little bit, trying to get past. That is pretty good. The other thing is that usually I would look at traffic and dirty air a lot more with this, although, to be honest, dirty air doesn't seem to be, at this stage, touch wood, quite as bad of an issue. The other thing we notice is that the Mercedes are very inconsistent, and perhaps this has a bit to do with the fact that they ran those tyres so long. So did some of the other drivers up here who pitted early, and maybe at the end, tyres just struggling, a lot more inconsistency. Also, could be just that they're experimenting a bit more with deployment. Hard to say, but it looks like Hamilton, Lindblad, Verstappen, Norris also pretty good. They stand out amongst the rest. And now for a quick look at the 20 fastest laps of the entire race, and it is Verstappen at the top by quite some margin, by nearly 4/10 in fact, because to be honest, on those hard tyres when they were new, so this lap was on 2-lap-old hard tyres on that last stint, he was pretty quick. And although you could look at it and say, well, Antonelli was only 4/10 off on 45-lap-old hard tyres, there is quite a big fuel difference there. So honestly, that pace from Verstappen at that point was not bad, and neither was the pace from Norris sort of in that region when they were battling either. It was pretty competitive, but again, both of them got pretty ruined by tyre wear. The rest of the times, it's largely Hamilton, Verstappen, and then Antonelli. Interestingly, no appearances from Russell, and perhaps maybe he was keeping some back in case he needed it. Maybe he was just looking after the tyres a bit more. Although that is one thing I would say about Mercedes, they could always still have been hiding a little bit in terms of engine and performance, although every team is still trying to balance that. Every team probably could push their engines further if they wanted to, but it comes at the cost of reliability. And finally then, on the race stuff, before we look at exactly where Mercedes had their advantage, even over their customer teams, here's the gap to the leader chart. So these dotted lines, they show as the drivers fall behind the guy in the lead. So this green dotted line is Russell, of course, in the lead for a large portion. That's why it's right at the top. And then Leclerc here, we have him chasing him. Where this line is quite flat, if not perhaps slightly trending upwards, that's where Leclerc is keeping pace with, if not catching up a little bit, to Russell in those closing stints. But we have to remember he was on new tyres. Of course, you see the big pit stops here, the big losses in time. And we can introduce some other drivers too to see the trends that we saw earlier in the pace chart. For example, here now is Hamilton, the solid red line, and we see him here relatively catch up. Both catching up to Leclerc, those lines are getting closer, but he's also catching up to the race leader. Again, newer tyres, that of course helps, but it's interesting to see. Antonelli, similar trend, in fact, towards the end, starts to pick up towards Russell, and we saw him close that gap. So I think he should be very pleased with his pace. You know, only second season, it is pretty damn impressive. And then what about Norris and Verstappen? Well, sort of in their own group. 2 stops, that's why you see another drop off here. And yes, look, at the end of the race, they were both keeping pace with the leaders pretty much. Norris, in fact, catching up a little bit. At one point, he was the quickest guy on track. But again, they stopped even later. They had even fresher tyres during that stint. So you have to take that with a pinch of salt. Now, one of the big questions is, if this year is all about the power unit and power units are going to dominate, why were McLaren so far off Mercedes? Now, we've already looked at one reason, and that seemed to be tyre wear. But another thing, we can also just look at this on the data, and fortunately we have relatively comparable fastest laps for the McLaren of Norris and Antonelli. They both did them at about the same point in the race. It's towards the end, what we just looked at on the gap to leader charts. It's that towards the end on the same fuel load. However, Antonelli on, I think, 46-lap-old tyres, Norris only on 19-lap-old mediums, Antonelli the hard tyre. So what can we see here? Well, for starters, it's just a big difference in deployment, and we see that pretty clearly. Relatively similar into turn 1, but it's then here into turn 3. Massive overspeed for the Mercedes. They're clearly able to keep deploying, whereas McLaren, they hit that super clip much earlier. Same thing again on the massive back straight, turn 9. It's not really entirely a straight, but still, again, that Mercedes line just tracks, you know, here 10 kilometers an hour higher and for much longer, staying higher before they sort of clip than the McLaren. And despite that, you know, in the practice sessions, we saw it sort of ebb and flow. If we saw sort of this Mercedes advantage at one point, you might see then a McLaren advantage at another point. But here, bizarrely, we don't. Now, what about cornering? Is it just downforce? It doesn't particularly look like we can blame it on that. Again, don't forget the difference in tyres here. Perhaps McLaren slightly down on downforce compared to Mercedes, although low-speed corners, McLaren performance looks slightly better, and then high speed, for example, here, turn 6, pretty comparable. So it does look like, again, deployment, and I'm pretty sick of saying the word, but it does seem to be the difference between the two. And again, deployment isn't just about where you can use the power. We of course saw on the speed traces that they've got more power at the end of the straights that they can use, but it's also how they're being able to regenerate that. For example, into turn 1 on this lap, the Mercedes is able to stay pretty much on power the whole way and then just hit the brakes, much less lift and coast compared to the McLaren. And you'd think because of that, the McLaren could then deploy a load more, but it just doesn't seem to happen. And again here, before turn 3, massive lift and coast. So This is the throttle trace, so this trace of the McLaren is coming down. He's hit 0% throttle. He's now coasting before he hits the brakes to recharge. The Mercedes does this a bit too, but it's just much later. It's about 50 meters later, which is significant. The gearing, so if we look at the gears that the cars are in over the track, we see how that McLaren of Norris generally hitting higher gears, also going through the gears earlier. It would suggest the car is shorter geared, so the gear ratios are basically just tighter together in the McLaren. Because McLaren do build their own gearbox, they have complete autonomy over that. And again, it's highlighted here, they're both, so here into turn 9, of course they're both in 8th gear, but the revs of the McLaren much higher, so this does look to be a gear ratio difference, and perhaps that's playing into Mercedes' hands, at least at this track. And just one final point on this, of course, we saw more lift and coast, and it does seem that we get slightly better initial acceleration for McLaren, perhaps with the more lift and coast. For example, here we see they're able to just pick up the power a bit quicker, get up to speed, accelerate faster out of the corners, although they've got that big loss of the lift and coast, and that is sort of what we see on the charts here. So this is the relative gap of Norris. We see he loses a massive amount into the corner from the lift, then gains it on the exit, perhaps because deploying more, but still the overall trend throughout the lap is just losing on the straight, especially at higher speeds. And it suggests potentially a software difference, because ultimately the engine hardware has to be identical between these two teams. And software potentially something that can move a lot quicker than physical car development, but potentially it could be an advantage Mercedes hang on to for a little bit longer, but it will be interesting to see how that moves forwards. But that's all the data I have for you in this video. I hope it's been useful and you've learnt something. It'll be interesting to see how things change up as we move to Shanghai next weekend. It's not exactly Monaco in terms of the layout, but it is something like the 7th slowest track on average compared to where we've just been in Melbourne being the 4th fastest. So the whole deployment thing is probably set to change and look a bit different. Maybe there'll be a bit more tyre wear compared to deployment battle. We'll see. But the order definitely could change because it's still such early days. But that's all, so thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.